We now begin session 4, which is titled Regulation and Prevention of Marine Pollution. Our moderator for session 4 is Mr. Hwang Jun-sik, Acting Director General for International Legal Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Republic of Korea. He's here at the venue in Seoul, and he's already there in his designated seat on stage. So I'd like to ask the Acting Director General to kindly take the floor. Mr. Hwang?
Thank you, Professor Yu. Hello, everyone. 안녕하세요. My name is Hwang Jun-sik, and I'm Acting Director General for International Legal Affairs of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea. It is a great pleasure and honor to be moderating a session at the 5th International Conference on the Law of the Sea, which is obviously one of the most important annual events for the ministry. Well, my colleagues and I are working on various issues of international law, and the law of the sea is definitely one of the most important part of our portfolio. And it seems that we are spending more and more time on environmental issues. Well, actually, yesterday, a lot of speakers, some of the speakers talked about the BBNJ, Marine Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. Actually, I'm with the Korean delegation to the Intergovernmental Conference on Marine BBNJ, along with one of our discussants, Dr. Mo. And I can tell you that BBNJ is the single most important matter our office is dealing with in terms of multilateral norm making. So anyways, this session is about regulation and prevention of marine pollution. Well, the issue of pollution sounds quite straightforward, if you will. And to the eyes of the public, the environmental pollution could come in many forms. It could be transboundary fine dust, or it could be dumping of radioactive water from destroyed nuclear power plants. But whatever the source might be, our focus is on how states should and could coordinate their efforts for prevention of marine pollution. And the main theme of this session is exactly that, especially in a regional setting. So our distinguished panelists will present a case analysis of various regions, namely Europe, Southeast Asia, and Korea, and probably Northeast Asia for that matter, and share their insights with us on what types of legal mechanisms could work to prevent and regulate the marine pollution. So now let me introduce our distinguished panelists. Although I didn't have time to get to know all of our speakers, I can assure you that we have the top-notch experts today, the right people for the right subject. First speaker is Professor Irini Papanicolopulu. She is the professor of international law at University of Milano-Bicocca. She's currently serving as a co-convener of the interest group of the Law of the Sea of the European European Society of International Law. And our second speaker is Dr. Yuna Lyons. She is marine policy analyst with the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. Her main areas of research include the ASEAN law and policy on marine environment and global ocean governance. And our third speaker is Ms. Jang Junyoung. She is the head of the International Affairs team at the Korea Marine Environment Management Corporation. She's an expert on the law of the sea and also an attorney, a member of the New York Bar. Finally, joining us today are two discussants, Professor Choi Ji-hyun of Jeju National University Law School and Dr. Mo Young-dong, head of the Policy and Social Value Department at the National Marine Biodiversity Institute of Korea. Our two gentlemen are frequent and trusted advisors for the Korean government in the areas of the law of the sea. Now, I'm going to minimize my own intervention as a moderator and try to give our speakers ample time to engage with one another. Each speaker is given 20 minutes, and for each discussion, 10 minutes. First, Professor Papanicolopulu will give us a presentation on MSP, Maritime Spatial Planning, which was adopted by European Union as a new and innovative concept for, to help coordinate the efforts for marine environmental protection. She will share with us, with her views, about the MSP's effects and limits. Hello, Professor Papanicolopulu. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Director Hong. Thank you to the organizers, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Korea, the Korean Society of International Law, and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea for the invitation. It is a pleasure to be with you today and to present on MSP and prevention of pollution of the marine environment. Let me first start with some basic facts and rules we should, however, all remember. Pollution of the marine environment is a very serious threat, so much so that the drafters of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea already included a definition of pollution in the convention. This is notoriously Article 1, Paragraph 4 of the convention, which defines pollution of the marine environment as the introduction by man, directly or indirectly, of substances or energy into the marine environment, including estuaries, which results or is likely to result in such deleterious effects as harm to the living resources and marine life, hazards to human health, hindrance to marine activities, including fishing and other legitimate uses of the sea, impairment of quality for use of seawater, and reduction of amenities. This is a very encompassing definition, so much so that it has been able to adapt to new forms of pollution, including pollution by noise, which is energy and thereby falls under the definition of pollution as provided for in Article 1, Paragraph 4, as well as what is the scourge of today's oceans, plastic pollution. Again, this is an introduction by man, by humans, of substances that have really deleterious effects and harm all the interests protected by this rule. Pollution is such an important issue that already the Law of the Sea Convention provides for some basic rules for addressing it so that it can be reduced and controlled. In particular, the Law of the Sea Convention, which is based on the scheme according to which the sea is divided into many maritime zones, provides for different duties of states in different zones. In the territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, the continental shelf, the high seas, and the international seabed area. These duties depend on the balance between the rights and duties of states in different maritime zones. But they are all guided by some fundamental principles, which we should always keep in mind when speaking of pollution of the marine environment and the efforts of states to address it. In particular, we have a general obligation under Article 192 UNCLOS, according to which states have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. This is a very broad, a very general obligation, which furthermore does not have any conditions. So, states must protect and preserve the marine environment. They have to take all necessary measures. This is something that they cannot avoid. And when it comes to measures, Article 194 provides that states shall take individually or jointly as appropriate all measures consistent with this convention that are necessary to prevent, reduce, and control pollution of the marine environment from any source. using for this purpose the best practicable means at their disposal and in accordance with their capabilities. And they shall endeavor to harmonize their policies in this connection. So Article 194 addresses at the same time both single effort by individual states and joint efforts by groups of states. And groups of states are particularly active, as you can imagine, in regional settings. So this is a provision that applies to regional settings in the first place, but also to the global environment, as we see now with the BBNJ negotiations. These provisions are provisions of due diligence. The ICLO-CBET dispute chamber has clarified that the due diligence obligation is not an obligation to achieve in each and every case the result envisaged by the norm, but rather it is an obligation to deploy adequate means to exercise best possible efforts to do the utmost to obtain this result. So when we go back to the general obligation, states have the obligation to protect and preserve the marine environment. Reading this obligation as a due diligence obligation means that it's not an obligation that says that whenever there is pollution, there is a responsibility of states, although we may end up there eventually in the future. But it says that states must do their utmost, must do everything they can to address protection and preservation of the marine environment. And what is this utmost? Of course, this is very much case dependent, time dependent, means dependent. It depends very much on the time, on the information at the hands of the state, of the means at the disposal of the state. But there are some general rules of thumb, I would say, in the first place, that the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, both in its seabed dispute chamber and in its advisory opinion as a full tribunal, has indicated. So what are these measures? I have here a list of measures. They include the adoption of laws and regulations, the taking of administrative measures, the exercise of a certain level of vigilance in the enforcement and the exercise of administrative control. Of course, the enactment of enforcement measures. We know that laws and administrative measures are useless if we don't have enforcement measures, but also the creation of monitoring mechanisms, which allow to investigate any alleged violations. And finally, but importantly, there must be adequate sanctions sufficient to deter violations and to deprive offenders of the benefits accruing from their illegal activities. Now, these are measures states can enact so as to respect their due diligence duty to protect the marine environment. Of course, the content of these measures will very much depend on the source of pollution, on those involved, on the consequences of pollution. And if we go back to see different forms of pollution, we have land-based pollution, we have pollution from vessels, we have pollution from dumping. So in different situations, states may be required to act differently. But what is important is that they do everything they can, they exercise their best possible efforts to achieve the result to protect and preserve the marine environment. It is in this light that the concept of maritime or marine spatial planning has been developed. And this is now defined by the UNESCO IOC as a process of analyzing and allocating parts of three-dimensional marine spaces or ecosystems to specific uses or objectives to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives that are usually specified through a political process. If we analyze this definition, we see in the first place that marine spatial planning or maritime spatial planning is not a single act, even a composite act. It is a process it is something that demands an ongoing commitment by all relevant actors. And it is a process of analyzing and allocating spaces to uses. So there is a first step of analysis. One has to identify what are the uses of a specific area, both the present uses and the future uses. And then allocate space, considering a 3-dimension, to these different uses or objectives. So an objective could be the preservation of a rare or fragile ecosystem, which implies that there will be no other uses in that specific area. Now, all this process is guided by 3 fundamental principles which make up the concept of sustainable development, as also incorporated in the Sustainable Development Goals. And these are to achieve ecological, economic, and social benefits. So on one hand, we have ecological interests, protection and preservation of the environment as such. We have economic interest, the development of human activities for the development of humanity. And finally, we have social objectives. And this is an area in which we have quick developments in an effort to engage more and more all relevant stakeholders in any specific area. Maritime spatial planning is based on some principles. The UNESCO identifies 4 principles. First of all, it must be ecosystem-based. So it must balance the ecological, the economic, and the social goals and objectives in order to achieve sustainable development. In the second place, and this is quite new in the context of protection of the marine environment, even if compared with the rules of the Law of the Sea Convention, it is an integrated process. It is an integrated process that integrates different economic sectors. It integrates fishing with transportation, with gravel collection, with aquaculture, with other activities. And then it has to be integrated among different governmental agencies. So we know that in most states, these activities may belong to different governmental agencies who may act on the basis of their own mandate. Maritime spatial planning requires states to integrate the actions and the policies of these agencies so as to achieve the common objective. In the third place, it is a process that is adaptive. And this is very much due to the fact that it is actually a process that unfolds through time. So the UNESCO considers that it goes in circles. There is a first circle, we learn from the first circle, we then go to the second circle, we learn from the second circle, and so on and so forth. And it has to be adaptive because we may not be entirely aware, we may not have all the necessary information in the first place. So when we make the first plan. Finally, and most importantly, this is a process that is participatory. So it is a process that, in order to be successful, must include all relevant stakeholders who must be actively engaged in the process. So not only state actors, but also all other actors, local entities, groups of individuals, groups of companies, the industry, civil society, all must be involved so as to contribute their knowledge, their ideas, and their visions to this process. Now, maritime spatial planning requires a balancing of different interests. This is a typical grid in which the compatibility or incompatibility between different uses of a maritime space is measured. And you see we have uses as different as maritime transport, coastal and maritime tourism, naval-based activities, coastal defense works, oil and gas extraction, oil and gas research, LNGs, cables and pipelines, aquaculture, trawling, small-scale fisheries, military areas, offshore sand deposits, dumping areas for dredging, and protected areas. So, maritime spatial planning requires, first of all, to collect information about uses, and then to assess, comparing these uses, whether they are compatible or incompatible, so as to maximize uses in a certain area that are compatible and try to avoid as much as possible or minimize the harmful effects of incompatibility. Maritime spatial planning often results in maritime zoning. So this is the area of Venice in Italy. I hope when COVID is finished, you may all visit this wonderful area. This is the Maritime Spatial Plan, in which different spaces, as you can see, are allocated to different activities. And this allocation has been done so as to allow activities to unfold as smoothly as possible without hindering, but rather trying to compensate other activities that may be prevented from taking place there. So this is maritime spatial planning, and maritime spatial planning has been incorporated by the European Union in one of its most important instruments concerning management of marine spaces. This is Directive 2014/89 EU, which has established a framework for maritime spatial planning. MSP is defined in the directive as a process by which authorities analyze and organize human activities in marine areas to achieve ecological, economic, and social objectives. So you see that the definition provided for in the EU directive is very similar to the one elaborated by UNESCO. And MSP in EU legislation is very much based on an ecosystem approach. So considering the oceans as a whole ecosystem, the elements of which need to be considered together in a holistic view. The MSP directive has set an implementation framework. It started on the 18th of September 2016 with the adoption of implementing legislation, and by 31 March next year, 2021, we should have in place maritime spatial plans. Actually, as is the case many times in Europe, but also in other parts of the world where we have regional efforts, not all states have achieved the same objectives so far. So you see this is an overview of the steps taken until November 2012 by different states. You can see some states have arrived to the implementation phase already. Other states need to adopt further steps to reach this step. But certainly, maritime spatial planning has to be seen within the framework of EU legislation concerning protection and preservation of the marine environment. In particular, the maritime protection, the directive for the protection of the marine environment, which is also an important element that has to be considered. So on one hand, we have MSP. It has a strong environmental component, which, however, is not the only one. On the other hand, we have strictly environmental instruments that on one hand feed into MSP the information, the data, and the results they achieve. And on the other hand, they are informed by MSP that allocates space to different uses that may promote protection of the marine environment or that may have an impact on protection of the marine environment. So MSP, which is a composite process, does not stand by itself within EU legislation, but is a part of a more general framework which is being adopted in order to address protection and preservation of the marine environment in a holistic way. Now, what are the benefits of MSP? According to the EU Commission, it has 4 important benefits. First of all, it reduces conflicts. It reduces conflicts between sectors and creates synergies between different activities, which in turn encourages investments, because the reduction of conflicts ensures predictability and transparency, which further encourages investments in maritime activities. Furthermore, and we have seen this in more than one situation across Europe, it is increasing cross-border cooperation. Whilst MSP is conducted in the first place by a state singularly, there are certainly areas in which it must be considered together with neighboring states. So we know that marine space does not have any physical boundaries. Waters move across the seas and oceans, and this demands very much cross-border cooperation in ensuring that there is no harm to neighboring states. Finally, which is one of the main objectives of MSP, MSP ensures protection and preservation of the environment through an early identification of impact and opportunities for multiple use of space. So on one hand, through the process of identification of uses and interests, we have an early identification of the impact that different uses may have on the marine environment, but also through the planning activities which allocate space in a reasoned way, there is the possibility for multiple uses which are compatible with each other, but also with the protection and preservation of the marine environment. So, is everything fine? Well, actually, we do have challenges. So, the first challenge is that we have different legal frameworks. In the EU, MSP is provided for in a directive which allows states to take implementing legislation that may, in some aspects, differ from one state to another. And this difference sometimes may make it harder to ensure cross-border cooperation, but also to achieve in the same degree the same objective. This brings to different substantive standards at the national, regional, and global levels. And this creates cross-border issues. Cross-border issues which are particularly significant across the European seas, which are relatively small. Sometimes there is not much more space than that occupied by the territorial seas of the different states, or a little bit of exclusive economic zone. And one particular aspect that has come to the attention of the EU is the difficulty to predict future uses. Maritime spatial planning is adaptive, yes, but it should also try to predict future uses so as not to enter into developments on a too rapid basis, which would create uncertainty rather than the predictability which is envisaged. And also there is an issue with stakeholder participation. In the first place, it is not always easy to identify all relevant stakeholders. There are many instances in which MSP has started without the identification of all stakeholders, and it was only after some plans were made that these were identified. And finally, of course, we have the issue of disputed areas. It is difficult to have a plan in an area that is disputed because the responsibility is not sure. I had a slide on MSP in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but I will skip this because I think I'm finishing my time. So what about conclusions? MSP is a necessary tool. European experience has shown it is a necessary tool to manage activities so as to preserve and protect the marine environment. It is turning from a potential to an actual tool with the enactment of the first plans. But unfortunately, in many situations, it has medium or low normative density. So it is conducted by acts that do not have high normative density. And it poses particular challenges for areas beyond national jurisdiction. So these are the lessons we have learned so far in Europe. We are now waiting to see what will happen globally. but this may be the object of a new presentation. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Papanicolopulu, for your very interesting presentation about various aspects of MSP. Well, I think I find it very interesting to see how this MSP goes beyond mere allocation of legalistic responsibility and to seek to be a holistic and an integrated approach.